Hi, on behalf of the GW Law Government Procurement Law Program, welcome to our webinar on the European Union's efforts to simplify vendor qualification through the Access to Procurement tool. I'm Chris Eukins, and I'm the Lynn David Research Professor in Government Procurement Law here at GW Law School. This is one of a series of webinars we've held for the global procurement community. Today's session has nearly 200 registrants from 49 countries around the world and from 19 states around the United States. A special thanks to our colleagues at the National Association of State Procurement Officials, NASPO, for passing the word on this webinar. The recording and materials from this webinar will be at publicprocurementinternational.com on the program page, and they'll also be on the GW Law Government Procurement Law YouTube page. The recording should be available later today. We are going to be, instead of having a chat, we're going to be using a Q&A function. Please feel free to use the Q&A function, and the panelists and I will be responding to questions as we go. And we'll also have, hopefully, an opportunity for discussion at the end with audience questions. The speaker statements are in their personal capacities. And just to bring focus to what we're doing here, Access to Procurement is very important. This webinar is very important, not only for the tool we'll be discussing, but more broadly, because Access to Procurement marks a first intersection between international trade and procurement and sharing contractor qualification information internationally. And we'll be talking about that in more detail. We're joined by two panelists today. Our first panelist is Dr. Lucien Cernat, the head of Global Regulatory Cooperation and International Procurement Negotiations at DG Trade, the European Commission. With more than 20 years of experience in the trade policy field, he was previously the chief trade economist at the European Commission in charge of economic advice on EU trade policy, influencing over 4.5 trillion euros of EU trade flows annually. Until 2008, Lucien held various positions at the United Nations in Geneva, dealing with trade and development issues. He has written extensively on the development impact of trade policies, WTO negotiations, EU preferential market access, regional trade agreements, competition policy, and corporate governance. Prior to his UN experience, he was a trade negotiator with the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Lucien obtained his PhD from the University of Manchester and a postgraduate diploma from Oxford University. Lucien's the author of a study on the easification of trade agreements, which provides important background for today's session and is available on the program page. We're also joined by a second panelist, Yvonne Benninger-Rothschild, who joined the European American Chamber of Commerce in New York City chapter as its executive director in October 2010. During her career, she's worked with and consulted for a number of nonprofits and for-profits, and was able to significantly contribute to their growth by raising their public profiles, geographic footprint, and relevance within their respective industries. In those roles, she has worked with clients and partners across the U.S. and Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Yvonne grew up in Germany, and she sees herself as European, dedicated to the idea that Europe needs to think, act, and be regarded as one entity. In her role at the EACC, the European American Chamber of Commerce, she focuses on promoting an active transatlantic discourse to engage the business communities on both sides of the Atlantic in a meaningful dialogue to create profitable partnerships and to provide a professional platform to exchange ideas. She's a graduate of the University of Applied Science in Ludwigshafen, Germany, where she earned a Master of Business Administration with a focus on marketing and controlling and finance. She's a member of the Bretton Woods Committee's Future of Finance Working Group, a fellow at the Tribeca Disruptor Foundation, and a member of the Transatlantic Business and Investment Council. She's also a member of the Economic Club of New York. More complete biographies for both our panels are available on the program webpage at publicprocurementinternational.com. The subject of the session, the European Union's Access to Procurement tool, allows vendors to check if they may participate in a public procurement competition outside the EU quickly and simply. The EU is a trading bloc with the most extensive network of bilateral free trade agreements, or FTAs. These trade agreements offer tremendous market access opportunities for EU companies. However, FTAs, the free trade agreements, are becoming increasingly complex. Tools such as Access to Procurement, which we'll be demonstrating, make it easier for EU firms to understand and take advantage of these free trade agreements. With that, I'll turn it over to Lucien. Lucien, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. First of all, allow me to say hello to all our participants around the world, and I'm glad to see that we have such a large audience. I would also like to extend my warm gratitude to you, Chris, for organizing this event, for allowing us to be part of the well-established series of webinars that you've organized over the years. And it's a great pleasure to have the possibility to illustrate and to do an online demonstration of this tool to essentially what we thought would be an occasion for the American audience to discover the benefits of the tool. So what I would like to do in the next few minutes are two things. I'd like to go very quickly through the background, the rationale, the why did we do this, who are the primary audience, the target audience that we have in mind for the tool. And then we will have a few minutes just to show you online how easy it is to use this tool, especially if you are a prospective European bidder interested in winning contracts, public procurement contracts in the United States. Just as a fun fact, perhaps it's important to remind ourselves that the United States government is the largest single customer in the world anyone can have. Is the biggest spending entity in the world. So I think any company that has goods, services, or other types of items that could be of use to federal entities, sub-federal entities, anyone in a public procurement agency, they should perhaps consider becoming a vendor for the US government, because it's a big business, right? So with that, I'm already hinting at the value of the tool in a sense that it gives you access to a huge market. It gives you access to a market that is subject to very complex rules. And as such, we believe that the tool will allow many European companies, including small and medium enterprises, to find it much simpler in knowing whether they should really invest in putting a bid forward for a particular contract or not. Bidding is quite expensive. It's a bit like a lottery. You know, you don't want to spend a lot of money on the losing ticket. You want to have some chances of winning, but you may simply bid for the wrong contract where you may not be eligible. So this tool allows you to make the distinction between whether you're legally entitled to bid or not. The second target audience, and I really like to also welcome our colleagues and friends from the NASPO network. The second primary target audience for the Access to Procurement are US procurement officials. The tool allows any US procurement official to get a simple answer to perhaps a very important question for which they need a good answer. The question being, do I need to respect the international obligations that my federal government or my local state has undertaken under the WTO government procurement agreement? I don't want to breach legal obligations because that can lead to litigation or to all sorts of other diplomatic incidents. So I believe that this tool will be very handy, and I look forward to hear from participants in the audience if that is the case once you see how it works. So Chris, we can now proceed.
And just quickly, Luciano, if I could just two quick things. First is that and I apologize, I don't control this application. So we don't have the Q&A function today. We have the chat function. One of my colleagues has changed it. So if the audience members have questions, please feel free to put it into chat. And I've already posted the link to the program page. And the other point is, Luciano, is that okay as we go along? Yvonne and I ask questions as we go. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Feel free to interrupt if you have any comments. So originally, as I said, the rationale for us investing considerable efforts and expertise in producing such a tool came from the feedback we received from the business community. More generally speaking, when it comes to trade agreements, the European Union has managed to create a vast network of free trade agreements, or trade agreements in general, also like the WTO agreement. Chris, sorry, I saw you saying something. I don't know if you wanted to talk to me. You are muted. Should I carry on?
Yes, please do.
So these trade agreements cover a vast amount of issues. They're extremely useful for companies who want to expand their activities abroad. They offer major market opportunities, but they're also very complex. So if you can go to the next element, please. Exactly. So this is a picture of a free trade agreement. And you can see terminus is very complex. It contains, are written not in the simplest English language. They're what I call sometimes legalese. So unless you are very well familiar with the intricacies of the language used in an international treaty or in an international trade agreement, you may easily get lost in the intersection of different annexes and different chapters. And the same is true for public procurement. I think we can move to the next element. Exactly. So even for procurement and other parts that are essential for companies to benefit from these FTAs, the question for us was, we cannot make them 20 pages. This is part of how trade agreements are negotiated everywhere by everyone around the world. The question then becomes, can we simplify these provisions and make sure that companies have simple digital tools which allow them with a few clicks to get the answer that they need in order to benefit from it. So to personalize and make this more specific for procurement, if we can go to the next slide. We have a similar issue with public procurement. So for instance, if you want to be a contractor for the US government, and by now you have found out on which tender notifications you would probably be capable of producing a software solution for a hospital or a software solution for a port authority, for the Department of Energy, or whatever entity would place such a solicitation, or even for NASA, if that is the case. Now, you know yourself as being in that market, you see that there is a call for tender, there is an opportunity for you to participate, but the question is, are you really legally, I mean, are there any obligations for the US public procurement authorities to accept your bid? And so here comes our tool, because if you click next, Chris, I'm sorry about my internet connection in case it's a bit unstable. I'm not sure if there's anything I can do about it right now. Let's hope it stays. So winning contracts in the United States or in any country is a very complex undertaking. For instance, if we were to look at the United States procurement provisions in the GPA agreement, so would you please click next, Chris? The US GPA agreement is rather complex. There is a US schedule of commitments, but then there are 7 annexes, and these annexes, they contain different parameters. So you need to pay attention to thresholds. These are minimum contract values, which will allow a European or a GPA country, company for a country to participate. So for small value contracts, the GPA doesn't give you any legal rights. It has to be above certain values. These are called thresholds. And they differ for federal, sub-federal, or other types of entities. Then there are different notes and exceptions, so different combinations of public procurement entities in the United States, in combination of goods or services or construction, and in combination with many other conditions, they may be then become either eligible or ineligible. So this combination of entities, threshold, types of products and goods, and exceptions and notes, plus the codes, the procurement codes for different sectors, this complicates enormously the decision that you would be faced with to say, yes, I should bid because I'm legally eligible, or maybe I shouldn't because there is no guarantee. So just to give you a sense of the number of combinations, the all possible combination of these and parameters I mentioned, thresholds, federal, sub-federal, you may end up with over 2 million possibilities before you say, yes, it's covered by the legal obligations, or no, it's not covered by the US legal obligations. So this is what the tool does. It cracks down the 2 million possibilities for you, and it will give you a personalized answer to the public procurement contract you are interested in. Let's move to the next one.
If I just could, Luciano, if I just throw in here. So when we were preparing for today's program, we talked about the sequencing here, and from a formal standpoint, the assumption is one would find an opportunity first and then check the Access2Procurement tool. And I said, no, that's not likely. That it's more likely that the Access2Procurement tool, which we're going to use in just a minute, a vendor would use that early in market research. But I couldn't figure out why. Why did I have this intuition? And now I finally figured it out. It's not just because, well, it is because I'm an old procurement guy. In the marketplace, in this marketplace, Luchan, if a vendor waits until a solicitation is published, the American term is they're roadkill. They cannot succeed if they wait until a solicitation is published, because the competitors have already been lobbying the agency, been talking to the agency. They know about the opportunity. They've already gotten ready for the opportunity. So pre-solicitation, there's an enormous amount of market research and gentle salesmanship that's already going on. So logically, the Access2Procurement tool would be used before the solicitation is published.
Yes, I think that's another specific use of the tool by interested companies that want to bid for contracts. Let me also, this is probably the right moment to illustrate why did I say that the Access2Procurement would be an excellent tool and a very useful helping hand for US procurement officials. You are about to launch one of these adverts on SAM. It may be a pre-solicitation, and maybe the actual call for tender, whatever, at whatever stage you are in the procurement planning, you better know from day one whether you will have to, by law, by these international obligations, whether you'll have to accept offers from the EU or from other GPA members for that matter. So as at the planning stage and at the publication stage, the tool facilitates greatly the life of a public procurement official in probably somewhere in a town or in a small department in somewhere in one of the states, which may have very good knowledge of public procurement law in the United States, but maybe not such a great knowledge of the GPA. So it can be extremely useful to ensure that you are on safe grounds when you conduct public procurement as an official, as a public procurement entity. So that's what the tool does in a nutshell. And then maybe I can show you a bit the logic, how it was built, and then we can move to the online demonstration.
I apologize. I understand from one of our guests, from Allison Anthony, that the chat has been disabled, and I apologize for that. Allison, if you want to post your question to me, I will read it for the audience. Thank you for your patience.
Right. So as I said, with request from our business community in mind, when we realized that there is a market, so we wouldn't build it and then there would be no customers, we went ahead and we created the Access2Procurement using algorithms to easify not just the GPA. In fact, this US GPA treaty and the trade provisions that apply to European companies is the latest addition to the tool. We launched Access2Procurement in order to facilitate the implementation of the EU-Canada FTA, CETA. That was the first one. So if you want to bid to Canada, now you have it there as well. It's as simple as what we're going to show you now for the US. And also for the Japanese market, we have a free trade agreement between the EU and Japan that has quite ambitious procurement provisions. So if you want to bid for procurement contracts in Japan as a European-based company, you will get the same straight answer, and that will facilitate your search and your market intelligence, as Chris said, tremendously, we believe. So the algorithm is based on our ability to translate rules and law into computer code. It's based on this logic of if then or if then else. So depending on yes or no, all these cascading questions, as I said, based on the actual legal text of the US commitments in the GPA. So we translated ad literam pretty much everything that is available in that complex document. And then we created a simple interface, which you will see in a minute right now.
If I could just respond to Allison's question. Allison asked whether or not the gentle salesmanship that occurs before the solicitation is published is just on transborder procurement or occurs in all federal procurement. And the answer is under FAR 15.201, it occurs in most federal procurement. The gentle salesmanship, the American term is blocking and tackling, because the salesman is blocking federal procurement officials in the hallway and trying to tackle them and sell their product. The salespeople will push to the limit how much they can have contact with the federal procurement officials. But FAR 15.201, in a revision that was made in the 1990s, codified the principle that we want to have as much contact as possible between market participants and the agency to help the agency in their market research. So there's a good deal of blocking and tackling that occurs before the solicitation is issued when the vendors are acting in self-interest. Okay.
But if I may jump in for a second, it also helps the vendors to be much more organized, and which then makes it easier for the officials, because you don't have to go through procurement requests when the company requesting it doesn't qualify. So it simplifies things on both sides, and it allows both sides to be more strategic in their approach to procurement.
Absolutely, yes. So, Chris, now I rely on your inside-out knowledge of the tool. You will be clicking here and there just to show how easy it is for anyone to use it. So let's walk our audience through an example.
What country would you like to use, Lucian?
I would like to use our best friend and ally, the United States. I suppose this is the main advertising point of our event today. So we could use Canada or Japan, but let's click on the United States. Anyway, the logic is the same. The tool is very similar in its construction.
May I use Maryland as an example? Is that okay, Lucian, based on our preparation? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine, yes.
And for entity per our preparation, I'm going to use the Port of Baltimore, which is in, I have to say to the audience, to Lucian's surprise, I told him I actually lived in the Port of Baltimore until a couple of weeks ago. We actually lived on Baltimore Harbor, so I'm very familiar with this. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And then I'm going to, what kind of services would you like to use for this example, Lucian?
Chris, can I suggest that perhaps we start from the very beginning? I still see the slides. Maybe you want to project the actual website and you take it from the very beginning so people can see.
Thank you for reminding me. My apologies. My apologies. So if we go back to the beginning here, this is the undoing of every professor using Zoom, that we forget what others can't see. So I'm going to use the United States as an example. And I'm going to select Maryland, which is right next door to Washington, D.C., for those of you from abroad. And then I'm going to select the Port of Baltimore as the entity. And hypothetically, Lucian, what kind of goods or services would be sold to the Port of Baltimore?
Yeah, well, I was thinking, just to make this a bit of a, we're talking about a digital tool solution for the 21st century. Let's assume that the Port of Baltimore wants to upgrade its software risk assessment tool, which now will have some artificial intelligence to select the right container they would now open to find counterfeit goods or any dangerous product, instead of opening all of them, the artificial intelligence, this algorithm and software that they want to buy from the market will help them better target such things. So there will be services. This is computer services, of course. And then let's say it's a high-tech advanced solution. So maybe it costs $1 million. I don't know. Or at least the company thinks it might be worth $1 million. That's what they would spend on it.
Is the tender subject to federal funds for airport projects? No.
Well, I would assume no, but
the Port of Baltimore has, well, we'll assume that it's being done on the harbor as opposed to being done at BWI. At the airport. Is the tender for any of the following services? And yeah, I see computer services are listed here, so I'm going to say yes, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Is the tender for the procurement of any service in support of military forces located overseas? No. Support of Baltimore. Is the tender for the procurement of printing services, which are often reserved? The answer is no. Does the tender involve the use of federal funds for mass transit and highway projects? So, no. What did we discover, Lucian?
So after this very long list of questions that we believe, because we tried ourselves and without the tool, we wouldn't even have realized that we need to go through these checks of yes or no. So once you have all this long list of conditions fulfilled in the right way, you didn't click the wrong button, then you get this assessment, which is, it says that on the basis of the information that you have provided as a potential bidder, we don't know if maybe you gave the wrong answer, you have to take that responsibility. You as a European company are legally eligible to bid for this tender on an equal footing with domestic suppliers. Then there's a bit of a disclaimer. We try to be on the safe side. We don't want to give you, I mean, you shouldn't take this to court. If you have a problem, maybe you should invest a bit more in some legal counsel. But we believe to the best of our abilities that this should be the case.
Just put your comment about legal counsel into
so
just to put their comment on legal counsel into perspective, Chen. So what the commission has done here is at the bottom has included relevant legal texts, and these are all the texts that feed into the decision tree that we just went through. And just as a practical matter, just so you know, Chen, the norm is in the Washington bar or in the procurement bar in general in the United States. If a lawyer is asked a trade question, they never answer the question without doing the research. That's just a rule. It's a rule that you have to look everything up, and it's a practical rule for the lawyers, which means that a lawyer answering this question, if they didn't have this tool, would have to go through all these legal agreements, and this could be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 of analysis for a lawyer before they could respond to this hypothetical company. Easily $5,000 to $10,000 worth of analysis.
If I may jump in, Lucien, a quick question. So I have now this answer about the Port of Baltimore. For some reason, as a company, I selected Maryland. Is there a shortcut, or what is the likelihood that other ports across the United States also are an opportunity from work at other ports is also accessible for me as a vendor? Can I do cross-reference across different jurisdictions, or is it safest to just go back and pick the other ports in the US?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and it comes back to the unintended use. We didn't realize that it may be very handy for companies to use it as prospective market research ahead of any real engagement. But here the answer is, I think, quite simple. So let's try it out, Chris. So suppose we want to go to another port. So click on, no, don't do anything there. Just click on the edit button next to Maryland. You see the second line? Yeah, if you, or let's, yes, click Maryland. And there you go, New York. And then next, and there should be the Port of New York somewhere in the list of entities. Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. You see everything else stays as you did it. So its services is 1 million. Okay, you may have a different list of questions. So hence the impossibility for us to generalize any answer. Remember, there are 2 million, roughly speaking, 2 million combinations of all these. The moment you change one tiny little thing, the answer may change completely from no to yes or from yes to no. So it's not the inability of the tool, it's the complexity of the US commitments under the GPA that prevents us from generalizing an answer. But you see, it's a 5-minute modification max. And you save 10,000 euros if we believe Chris.
Excellent.
Just a quick question. So in
and that maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Lucian, in similar databases in the U.S., like such as the Federal Procurement Data System, there have been APIs established with outside entities, where the outside entity is a third-party information provider, for example, through an API hooks into the federal data system and then can generate more sophisticated answers. For example, usaspending.gov is a very sophisticated, user-friendly access to the federal procurement data system. That was actually originally developed by a nonprofit called OMB Watch, and they sold that. They sold that front end to the US government because it was so successful. They were a third-party entity, a nonprofit that hooked into a federal database, generating very user-friendly reports. And the federal government thought it was so worthwhile, they incorporated that into and created USA Spending. So, Lucian, will the commission, through the use of APIs, allow third parties to hook into this database so they can create, for example, a cross-US analysis of reports?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer to your question at the moment. I don't know what is our policy with regard to sharing data, allowing third party to access our own servers or our own websites. I could look into it with our IT department, because one thing I didn't say, but perhaps I should use this opportunity to congratulate and to put on record the tremendous effort and expertise that commission officials in Digitrade put into the development of this tool. This is a completely in-house made online tool, which was the outcome of an excellent collaboration between people in my team, in particular Jakob Cornides, my colleague, and our IT department. They worked very hard to develop the underlying logic of the algorithm, and then a very surgically precise as we can be of translating legal obligations into such simple answers for companies or for US or Japanese or Canadian procurement officials, who by now we know, because we have feedback from Canada and Japan, public officials in those countries, they already tried it out and they find it quite useful for their own internal planning and decisions. So that's why I was quite optimistic that NASPO colleagues would also find it quite interesting to have a look at, perhaps try it out. We have by now, I think, 8,000 users of the tool, although it's a very recent addition to our toolbox. So we expect now, with the United States being launched, we expect that number of users to increase as well.
Yeah, I should just say to highlight the work of the Commission in these trade negotiations through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the CETA agreement that you referred to with Canada. Canada has agreed to make transparent all three levels of opportunities, at the national level, at the provincial level, and the local level. If the United States were to do the same thing, that would be an extraordinary development. If Yvonne were to ask me, how many computers are being purchased today across the United States at the state and local level, no one can tell that because the information is not readily available across all the states and local governments because opportunities are not uniformly well published. So that kind of the European Commission's success in working with Canada to make Canada's procurements uniformly accessible was a very important benchmark for the rest of the world.
And it's also, it would be good to have on the back end of this tool, direct access to the opportunities that you mentioned on the onset of the program, meaning having access to federal procurement and see, okay, so I can, I qualified to bid on an AI solution at the Port of New York and Baltimore. Then how, what's the next step? How do we tap into the actual opportunities? It would be good to have a connection into the federal procurement system and maybe even the state procurement system going forward.
The experience, Yvonne, in the federal marketplace over the last 20 years is that you're exactly right, and that third-party consulting vendors will step into that space and will provide that kind of integrated information. And then those third-party information integrators, over time, that market will commoditize, and the consultancy, the access to that information will get cheaper and cheaper over time, and you can then move down to the market. The small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, will have access to it. It won't occur right up front, but over time, as with everything else, it commoditizes in that market. That information will be readily available in the private sector.
Yeah, and if I may add, that's an excellent suggestion. I think as we did for the Canada part of the tool and for the EU-Japan FTA part of the tool, in close cooperation with our trading partners, with the Canadian government and with the Japanese government, we created these cross links. So for instance, if we were to run an example for Canada or Japan, we would see at some point a link to this single entry portal in Canada where every single tender and every single contract that we and the Canadian authorities have to publish for the benefit of their trading partners, that link would be in our tool. So there is this two-way street between their integrated one-stop shop digital solution and our access to procurement. Now, unfortunately, I think I may be wrong, but I think in the United States we only have such a one single portal for federal procurement. Whereas for the states, in particular for the GPA covered states, we wouldn't have such one single website. So that could be subject to perhaps some cooperation or MOU or any other cooperation engagement with US states. With the Japanese government, we also managed to disseminate this tool. The Japanese government issued some administrative guidance, which they distributed to all the procurement authorities, saying essentially, hey, I know this compliance with EU-Japan FTA can be tricky sometimes. Here's a tool for all of you to help you in those decisions. So feel free to use it. And I'm told that in Japan, administrative guidances are very effective nudges, so people actually do what those guidelines say.
The practical problem, Luciana, I think I completely agree with you about making more information more readily available is the political will at the federal government level. We have a historical parallel. We have a historical example. When the Obama administration inherited the financial crisis from the Bush administration at the beginning of 2009, the Recovery Act was passed, and it had hundreds of billions of dollars of procurement going through both at the federal level and then at the state and local level through grants. The Obama administration, because Obama was our first African-American president, was very afraid of attacks regarding corruption from the right. So in order to address that concern about political attacks from the right, the Obama administration required that all the opportunities be published, that they be published at the state and local level as well, in order, through the use of transparency, to mitigate the risk of corruption that would undermine the legitimacy of the Obama administration. And as a result, there was much more transparency for the $785 billion in procurement under the Recovery Act than we have now. We basically have receded back towards non-transparency. We've lost transparency since then because only the Recovery Act and its implementing regulations force that transparency. So the answer to your question, it is doable, but we lack the political will.
But isn't it more also a question of the UK Federal Anti-Bribery Act? I mean, regulation worldwide has changed, you know, in an effort to make procurement more transparent, both in Europe, in the US, and in the UK and other places.
Absolutely correct. And that's, Yvonne, it's a top-down from the UK Bribery Act, from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, from other anti-corruption statutes around the world. Absolutely right. But also, Yvonne, importantly, bottom up. Both President Obama and President Trump signed bills calling for more open data in government. So the presumption 20 years from now, Yvonne, will be that all data will be accessible at all times within the federal government and potentially within state and local governments, but certainly the federal government. And the systems are being built now to make everything transparent all the time on basic open data principles.
Mm. It also makes government procurement more effective. To make it easier, it cuts down red tape, it cuts down work, it gives access to more attractive bids. And it's part of our newfound favor for friendshoring.
Yes, I absolutely agree, and that's why we're big supporters of things like the open contracting efforts that were being done by using common standards to make everything accessible. And it could be done between the European Commission and the United States if there are more regulatory cooperation, for example, under something like the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, if that were revived.
Well, to really add to that very quickly, the existing level of cooperation between the United States and the European Union on a large array of issues, either in the Trade and Technology Council, where we have some aspects of public procurement being jointly addressed, including green procurement, for instance, best practices in green procurement, but also in the government procurement agreement at the WTO. We have a long-standing, strong alliance with the United States, and we share the same values and the same principles. So transparency and ensuring that we make the most out of this agreement that we have signed in good faith and being convinced of its value. I think we share that common understanding. So I'm quite excited about the possibility to further cooperate with the United States, both at federal level and at sub-federal level, in making sure that we implement and we make the most out of our GPA commitments. And this tool is aimed to do that in a, as a transparency tool. So I look forward to any follow-up questions or engagement requests for clarification from US officials.
When I was just becoming a professor at Chan in 2002, at that point, standards for accessibility for persons with disability, having accessibility to federal information technology, were being published. And I raised my hand and I said, why don't you use international standards? Why not cooperate with the Europeans? And this is in 2002. I was viewed as a wild radical to suggest that. When the standards were revised in 2000, staff members from the European Commission fed directly. They were participating in the advisory process, and the standards, as they were revised, they adopted standards that are really the center of gravities in France. They adopted the international standards for accessibility. So between 2002 and 2000, the US government agency charged with accessibility standards proved that it is possible to cooperate as a regulatory matter between the European Commission and the United States. Would you like me to relaunch the PowerPoint presentation? Or Yvonne, did you have a comment?
No, I was just saying, I mean, it's so obvious if you think about it, to have joint standards. I mean, most companies are operating on a global market. They're not producing for one or the other region. And then it's again, it's effectiveness. It's more effective, to do business with common set of standards.
We just wanted to talk to illustrate another utility of the rule. I want to talk just about a few minutes about the Build America, Buy America. We've had previous webinars. Ika Klopper from the European Commission staff in Washington has joined us for those. And there's extensive materials available on BABA on Public Procurement International. And it's a major point of contention at this point between the European Union and the United States, and I'll explain why. So this is part of the infrastructure legislation that was passed in November 2021 led by the Biden administration and passed by Congress. And it says that the BABA says that any items that are being purchased for federally funded infrastructure shall be made in the United States. Now, in implementation, the final standards were just issued the final guidance was just published by the Office of Management and Budget. This is a very complicated set of guidance, set of rules. But the thing we want to focus on today is the requirements as they apply to state procurement, because many states, 37 of the states, have signed up, as we saw from this example, in Access to Procurement. We looked at Maryland, we looked at New York State. Many of the states have signed up to free trade agreements, such as the Government Procurement Agreement, that open up their marketplaces. And in fact, BABA in Section 70901, just like the Recovery Act in Section 1605, it says that the act is supposed to be applied consistent with U.S. trade obligations. But the final guidance that was just issued on August 23rd by the Office of Management and Budget, that final guidance doesn't specifically say that there's an exemption for, let's say, a Belgian vendor that wants to sell into state markets where the state is using federal infrastructure funding to make its own procurement. The final guidance is the guidance that's published at 2 CFR 184 is silent. There is guidance in a memorandum issued by M22 by OMB M22-11, but that memorandum says that the Belgian vendor has to seek a public interest waiver in order to access the state opportunity, even though the GPA gives that Belgian vendor, as an EU member state company, access to that Maryland procurement. And our colleague Jean Greer, I think, is on with us today. Jean Greer has written about this extensively on her website, jage.com, and Jean has done a very good job of elucidating this problem. So here you see on the left-hand side, just this diagram, access to procurement will give the vendor a green light. They say, oh, I can sell to the Port of Baltimore. Oh, I can sell to the Port of New York. But then they run into the BABA wall. If Port of Baltimore is using federal infrastructure funds, if they're using federal infrastructure funds, they will be blocked, even though the trade agreement didn't reserve that. So while they would have had access normally to that Port of Baltimore opportunity, they won't because of BABA, very possibly. So we have just a few minutes left, and I just wanted to focus on this trade issue and then the other issues, the corollary, the issues here. So first of all, with regards to qualification, so I've been a procurement professor for way too long, and I never thought there are three things that you have to worry about in any procurement. You have to worry about price, technical, and qualification, the contractor's qualifications. I never thought about nationality as a qualification element. What the tool does is it makes that clear. It is a qualification element. It's really cool that you've basically crystallized the way people think about procurement, saying, no, nationality is the starting point. Where you come from is a starting point question for qualification. The practical problem is that your tool is better than the regulations. The U.S. Trade Representative negotiates all these, we'll say, well, this minor federal agency is included in the list and this is not. The Federal Acquisition Regulation, when it implements the treaties or the trade agreements, the Federal Acquisition Regulation is a very blunt tool. They say all executive agencies, they don't have the precision of the trade agreements. What your tool does is it's much more precise. You have to wonder whether or not we should still have the regulations, because the tool is more precise because it actually identifies the specific agencies, where the regulations just clump them in these big sets. So really, there's an open question whether or not we even need regulations. And you talk about that in the piece, in your Cyrano piece. You talk about the evolution of technology and the law, that eventually technology may take the place of law. But it opens up, now we have this qualification information very easily accessible. It opens up the next step question, which is, should Europe, for example, be sharing information with the United States about other qualification issues, like who's corrupt? Should we be sharing that information efficiently? I want to focus just on the trade issues just for a second. That's the center column here, and say, okay, Lucian, if we walked through an example before where I'm a Belgian vendor and I want to sell computer services, and it turns out I can sell to the Port of Baltimore. Hooray! That's a positive. Okay, let's say that's a positive. BABA makes that potentially, if Baltimore is buying, and services are maybe a bad example, if they're buying goods, if the Port of Baltimore is buying goods, this positive may turn out to be a false positive because BABA may block it. What happens at that point? The vendor finds out, oh, access to procurement gives me green light, but BABA says no. What should the vendor do at that point?
Well, I think the vendor should, first of all, be puzzled by that distinction, and they should come to us. I think we would welcome any concrete example from European companies who have used our tool. They found that under our own legal assessment, as close and thorough legal assessment one could make in good faith of an international agreement. If that answer is yes, you appear to be qualified, and if they receive a different answer from the contracting authority, Port of Baltimore or New York, any other department or any other agency, and if the reason given would be that, sorry, but we cannot buy this from you because BABA prevents it, I think we would be extremely interested in being alerted to such situations, and we will carefully look into it and see if there's any follow-up we can give. But I would clearly, short answer, yes, please flag it to us, by all means.
So the bottom block here identifies in the green identifies that there might be disputes that bubble out of this. And Christian Adig and I are publishing an article tomorrow in the government contractor. It's a Thomson Reuters publication, and we'll republish it on the Social Science Research Network, ssrn.com. And we point out that there could be potential retaliatory actions. And this isn't our idea. This is pointed out by members of industry in the BABA comment process. There could be retaliatory actions such as the European Union's international procurement instrument, or there could be the vendors, this Belgian vendor might bring a bid protest, and there could be a push in future trade agreements to include more subcentral entities, because the importance of including the subcentral entities in the trade agreements is becoming manifest. I just want to go to the right-hand column here, because you and Zornitsa Kalita Dimitrova have done so much work in this area. The European Commission has done so much work on this question of prime data versus the data on penetration by suppliers and subsidiaries. So just to put this in highlight, the U.S., when it focuses on procurement trade between Europe and the United States, focuses on prime contracts, whereas you and your colleagues at the European Commission have developed an analytical tools to look at the second level. What access, for example, do American vendors have to European Union member state markets at the secondary level as suppliers, selling through subsidiaries perhaps in Europe? And the data that you regularly publish on cross-border procurement, the data shows to an astounding extent the access that American vendors have to the European market. And you show that in reverse. You show that in the publication we have on the Cyrano publication. If you just look at the prime contractor data, everything that the Europeans are selling into the American markets is transportation. It's like things like Siemens just dominates the marketplace. But when you look at the secondary level, which is what you guys have done, when you look at the secondary level data, the suppliers, subsidiaries, it's a much more diverse marketplace. It's not just transportation. It's things like medical devices, et cetera. It's a very diverse array of vendors who access the U.S. market. So you've done a wonderful job in terms of the data analysis. And now with this tool, Lucian, you've sort of democratized the whole thing, because a vendor who's interested isn't just interested in prime contract. Remember, they're doing this analysis early on. I want to sell computer services to the Port of Baltimore. They're not necessarily a prime contractor. They may come in as a subcontractor. This tool illuminates the fact that the marketplace is not just about prime contractors. It's about subcontractors, suppliers, parent companies selling to subsidiaries. You've democratized the marketplace. You've made everybody have access to this trade information, and highlighted that we care about everybody, because we're really caring about trade flows in general, solutions in general. And did you want to comment on that?
Well, very quickly, I wouldn't comment on my own work on public procurement in the analytics behind. I hope and I'm glad to hear that it's been useful in elucidating the multiple layers and the complexity of supply chains in public procurement. Many companies need first tier, second tier suppliers, and we in the EU do not have any rules. I mean, you can use any subcontractor you want. But in the US, there are rules. And listening to you now, Chris, I just realized that, in fact, there is another unintended third audience for our tool, the American companies themselves. If you are an American company, and if you have a choice in front of you of subcontracting some parts of that big project to European companies, you may be afraid that by doing so, you will be subject to buy local requirements that are in Buy America, Buy American, or maybe BABA now. The tool tells you that if you tick the right boxes, if the contract you're interested in falls under these 2 million combinations where there is a green light, you can subcontract anything you want with no legal restrictions because the GPA gives you the right to do so.
And it could be an add-on. So if you bid for a contract as an American company, there's one part of the service missing. You could bring in strategically a European to help you win your own contract with the U.S. government. But I think the beauty is in this tool is also with what Chris indicated earlier, which is the data that we get out of this. I mean, I think there's a lot of analysis to be had. You know, once you really get companies using this, and see, you know, how you know, to utilize this as a strategic tool, both for the EU, seeing what companies are doing, what companies are eligible for, what kind of projects, if we can cross-reference that going forward. And then also for the companies themselves, you know, the suppliers bidding on contracts, they can take their own analysis out of that tool.
Thank you very much for both of you. We're almost out of time, so I just quickly want to note that the next webinar, by coincidence, happens to be just an hour from now. The Defense Acquisition University will be holding a webinar on possible debarments of contractors for violations of U.S. labor laws. That webinar, the information is available on the Defense Acquisition University events page, and we'll be talking about that. We'll be turning that webinar an hour from now. If you're interested in issues of debarment, issues of labor violations in the U.S. market, please feel free to join that webinar. And as I said before, the materials and the recording from this session will be available later today. We're a shoestring bunch here. So basically, as soon as the professors can get their acts together and get the recording posted on YouTube, and then I'll link it as well at Public Procurement International. So thank you all very much, Lucian and Yvonne. I'm very grateful for your participation. Any last words?
If you have any questions about, you know, doing business in Europe, or if you're a European company and you need information on doing business in the US, do reach out. Our website, eaccny.com, you find my contact information, and we will be happy to help you.
Lucian?
Very good. Just once again, many thanks for the excellent opportunity to present this to people, and I hope it was useful.
Thank you very much. Lucian, have a good evening, and Yvonne, have a good day. Thanks
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Very good.